It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the 43rd International Symposium on Intensive Care and Emergency Medicine here in Brussels. My name is Fabio Taccone. I work here in Brussels, and I'm very delighted to kick off this meeting together, of course, with my mentor and visionary creator of Isicem, Professor Jean-Louis Vincent, who is here in the first row. So we have gathered here in Brussels more than 4,000 attendees from all over the world to dive into the depths of the critical care excellence. We hope that this event will be a great event for all of you. I'd like to remind that 43 is not a meaningless number. Cicero was more than 43 before Christ. Romans went to Britain and founded Londinum, now London, in 43 after Christ. Unfortunately, they forgot to bring the best Italian cooking recipes, but that's another story. 43 is a famous Spanish liquor, and the movie 43 is one of the most outrageous comedy ever made, so of course I don't expect Isicem to be outrageous, but maybe one of the best events you've ever been before. To organize the meeting, you require a blend of vision, because you need to fix the objective and the purposes. You need to have a planning, because you need new ideas from the advisors, fix your faculty. You need a top-notch organization, because of course you have to manage logistics and registrations, and you have a flawless execution, because you need to find support, and of course organize feedback from the attendees. And this would not be possible without this great team of Isicem that is led by our general manager, Veronique, who's just there, very close to me, they work very hard to make this event possible. And of course, we also have to thank our advisors for the ideas that they brought during the discussion we had to prepare this program. As you know, the attendees of Isicem are really at the heart. They're just not participants. We try to prioritize their needs, their interests. We try to prepare a cutting-edge program, respecting, of course, diversity and inclusivity, and giving different formats. And of course, that should not be just, presentation and lecture, but we hope that we can raise, of course, discussion, we can encourage collaboration, and if possible, developing new network opportunities. This year, we put on the social media 2 initiatives. One is the first-time Isicemmer, so those who are for the first time in Isicem. We hope, of course, that you will come many more times in the future, but we also have the Isicem ambassador. I would say like, some veterans, seasoned veterans, if I may, that have come a few times. They know very well how it works. They love Isicem. So if you get lost, you can see people like myself having an Isicem ambassador badge. You ask them, maybe they can guide you to different rooms all over the Congress. I realized that I'm also an Isicem ambassador, and my first Isicem was 20 years ago. It was at the ESL, already 20 years, I know. And this was the program, the opening session. Of course, the opening was given by Jean-Louis Vincent, and I realized that the word sex was presented 2 times. It's a very weird opening session. The round table was around hemodynamic monitorings. We had 2 great fathers of the critical care medicine who were there at the opening session, Hector Wong and Harry Weil, with one of the first great collaboration from ANZICS be presented with a SAFE study. And Stefan Brett discussed about terrorism has to be prepared. We all know, unfortunately, what we've experienced with terrorism in the following years. But also many things have changed. In 2004, early go-directed therapy, activity in protein C, hypothermia for cardiac arrest, tight glucose control, steroids for septic shock, low tidal volume for all ARDS patients. Some of these therapies are not used anymore or proven not to be as effective as we thought. Maybe there is still a role for steroids in septic shock. And ARDS management has evolved, and now we have a lot of sessions on the use of ECMO, for example. There was no one single session on ECMO in 2004. But also our discipline has evolved with a lot of innovation, but also humanization of what we do. We talk now about green ICU, the importance of the multidisciplinarity in the ICU. We try to phenotype our patients to better understand which subgroup of patients could be treated. We also promote a lot education and simulation to improve the training of our younger colleagues. We, of course, we always should respect diversity, not only in terms of gender and age, but also of patients with some handicap. And we discussed last year about the ablays in the ICU. And you will hear about, of course, the role of augmented or artificial intelligence in the ICU. We had a great roundtable in last weekend, and Maurizio and Azra will make you a report very soon. This is the plan of the Congress. Many different floors, many different rooms, don't get lost. And you are here in the heart of Brussels. You can also enjoy, but outside the program, of course, you know, the nightlife in Brussels, having some beers maybe. Don't forget to visit our exhibitions, because in the exhibition, that not only the exhibitors, of course, but today we will have the poster presentation at 6 p.m. There will be also welcome from everyone. We will have just some boxes dedicated to simulation and, of course, fountain water to make you not be thirsty during the meeting. I gave you a lot of information on how the meeting is organized. Don't hesitate to download our app. You will find the scientific program, all the information I gave you. And don't forget to follow us on social media. Of course, Isicem is also not only, you know, I said science, but is also social. So we will have a social event on Thursday evening. We will be at the Spirito, very close here to the venue, from 7 p.m. until, we don't know. Of course, don't forget to be there Friday morning, but enjoy the meeting. There are still some places left, so don't hesitate to contact our organizers if you want to participate. It's important also to remind to everyone that this kind of event cannot exist without the great support of the industry. So we have to thank, of course, our platinum sponsors, our 11 gold sponsors who have supported us, and our 8 silver sponsors. Thanks for, again, the support to our meeting. I would like to conclude reminding you that Isicem also organizes other events which is very relevant for our practice. We will have our echocardiography course in November. We will start again, the first time after COVID, the cardiovascular respiratory physiology course with a great faculty. And we will have our Rome event just before Christmas in December. That will be around sepsis or IV fluids. So maybe put this in your calendars if you're interested. And together with our Italian colleagues, we are now at the 13th edition of EuroNeuro, a dedicated meeting to neuro ICU and neurointensive care in Florence at the end of October. So I think my time is over.
I'm Derek Angus from the University of Pittsburgh in the US, and my colleague Elie Azoulay from Paris, France. We're going to co-chair this fantastic session. We're going to get it launched with a report on the roundtable that ran this weekend on the role of artificial intelligence in the ICU. And so we thought it was important to find 2 of our most intelligent intensivists to run this session. So I'd like to invite up Maurizio Cecconi from Istituto Clinico Humanitas from Milan, and Azra Bihorac from the University of Florida in the US.
So, good morning, everyone. Great pleasure to be here, and thank you, Derek, Elie, and Jean-Louis and Fabio. Thank you for asking us to chair this roundtable the last 3 days. I did this with Azra Bihorac. It was really a great pleasure. We did a lot of work before the roundtable, and the discussions, I have to say, personally, I found some of the most stimulating in a long time. So in 20 minutes to put all the conversations that we got together from this group of people is not something easy. So we will try over the next 20 minutes just to give you some key messages, but then watch this space, because we got so many ideas. We want to put them to the ground with some publications, maybe with some recommendations and call for action. And we have a great opportunity with artificial intelligence now, because we have a great crisis. Our intensive care unit, healthcare system, they are facing major crises. The demographic changes, a population that is aging, which means older and sicker patients, more patients to look after, maybe more patients to try to prevent acute disease, and less healthcare workers. So how can we balance this? Well, technology, and we should be optimistic about biotechnology, because this is the story of human beings, always allow us to find new solutions. And I think we have to drive this revolution now with AI. Just days before our roundtable, the AI Act came out in Europe. I'm not going to dwell too much into this. We will have to always to deal with regulations. That is not a problem. We need to adapt to these regulations. We need to respect the regulation wherever we work. But you should not be an excuse not to play with the technology, not to understand how new technology can really help us to improve outcomes for our patients, the experience of patients and families, and I think also the work of healthcare workers. So some key messages of these days together. Well, really, we have to embrace this revolution because in medicine, probably in all of medicine, ICU, it has been for a long time, and it is one of the most important and data-rich environments. So we have digitalized things well before other areas. Now we need to understand how we can use this, and that's the way we have to drive this. And the problem that we have is that maybe we have too much information. And having too much information doesn't necessarily mean that we have knowledge from this information. So in a way, how can we, bombarded by all the signals of our ventilators, of the clinical, of the vital signs, of the waveforms, of the CT scans, how can we get a real signal from the background noise? And so statistics has always been there. And I remember when I started to do research also more than 20 years ago, when you start to have an idea and then you plot two variables, you're very happy if you find this, right? This is almost a perfect correlation between two variables. And if you're thinking about submitting your abstract to Isicem or to Elie, this is very likely to be accepted, you think. But is there plausibility to explain the correlation between these two variables? This is real data from the Institute of Statistics in the US. And if I show you what it is, I don't think we want to believe that there is plausibility here. This is per year consumption of mozzarella cheese and doctoral degrees for engineers. Is it really that if you eat more cheese, is it more likely you get a PhD in engineering? I don't know. But certainly, we need to think about this. This is very tempting now. We can just put data into computers. They can data crunch it for us. I think we should be a bit careful about that. But at the same time, we don't need to understand everything. I'm not sure that any of us here understands perfectly how the car works, but maybe we understand some key principles. So black boxes, not so sure for the immediate adoption. We don't need to explain everything, but probably we need to have some plausibility between variable A and variable B, especially when we move from association to causality. Or in other words, as Ronald Casey once said, is that if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything. So how do we bring our intellect and our way of thinking and reasoning and making decisions to the new world of data? Interesting, we were reflecting with the group that often when you have a big crisis, whether it's an healthcare crisis like the recent pandemic or the plague or choleras, the human beings somehow find technology that can help to solve problems. And I think we are in that convergence of events in human history now, probably also with AI. The best example of data science and how we can use data in a clever way, I think, is from the first example, is probably the story of John Snow. John Snow was one of the first anesthesiologists and epidemiologists, and he was called to help to understand how to solve the problem of a cholera outbreak in London in 1854. Think about the background. We didn't know all the things that we know now about infectious disease. There was a story of miasma. Maybe it's the bad smell in the air that is causing the disease. Some other people were thinking maybe it's germs. So some hypotheses, very similar to what we do now. And what John Snow did was actually plotting data and putting clusters of people that were dying and noticing that the deaths were concentrated around the water pump in the area of Broad Street. With some exceptions that were giving some more consistency to his theory. There was a workhouse where poor people were given shelter and work, and they didn't have many deaths there. They didn't have deaths, but he discovered that they had their own water well. And monks in a brewery, they were not dying because they were not drinking water, they were drinking beer. So one first message, of course, is that beer is better than water, and the second message was probably the reason for the cholera is in the water. So that's the association. What was his intervention? Let's stop people drinking from that water. And if you go to Broad Street today, you can still find the original water pump without the handle, which was the intervention to stop people getting sick. That solved the cholera outbreak. We have many more sophisticated things now, and how can we use them in practice? As I said, we need to have plausibility, but I don't think we need to expect to understand everything. Artificial intelligence may bring us augmented powers even in diagnostics. This is a very fascinating paper. Algorithms can just look at the fundus of the retina and understand if they are looking at a man or a woman. This is not something that the most experienced ophthalmologists can do. And we also know that now ChatGPT and other softwares can perform incredibly well with SMLE exams. But is that being really a doctor? Is it just that part of us being a doctor? I think we're forgetting probably that there is more than just passing an exam. But we were discussing this during these days, and probably we will see this happening. There are tools now in our hands. We have to understand how to use them. They will probably become assistants, and maybe they will become colleagues one day. So first message is, we are far away for a full closed-loop system, and I don't think we would like to adopt that. But we are very close, and we can do it, and probably the biggest barrier is ourselves on how to have an augmented approach with artificial intelligence to what we do. I'll go a bit faster on some of the messages, because there is really a lot, so these are just some summaries of the discussions that we had. But think about augmented clinical decision-making. Think about diagnostic application. Think about point-of-care testing, image acquisition, helping you how to get the right imaging. So this can really be a way, probably, to truly personalize medicine, where we really are enabled to understand the phenotype of the patient and maybe try to select the best treatment, try to decrease the uncertainty that is in front of our eyes. Maybe it's a way to finally bring implementation science, so to bring therapies that we know that work, but we've not been able so good to deliver in the past. But there are also some low-hanging fruit. I'm sure that you're all using ChatGPT, and if you don't, probably you should start to use it to help your work, not to replace your work. So maybe prompt writing for clinical notes to make sure that the notes are good to be read maybe in 5 years or 10 years when there will be a claim, and you want really to show that there has been a good decision process documented there. But how do we go there? Well, we need data. We need interconnectivity, we need connected devices, we need to connect everything, and everything needs to be interoperable, which means that we have technical challenges for this. It's not just having the digital data. There is a lot of digital data, but we may not have the infrastructure to query the data. And a lot of people may think that if you go outside of the hospital, that you can just do a query now and see if the patient in ward A is deteriorating and maybe comes to the ICU. I think we should do that. The reality, most of our queries now are retrospective. Maybe we can do them 2-3 weeks, maybe a year after. So we need to interconnect everything. We need to adopt standards that will make a real-time interrogation possible. And we need to share data. We need to share information. In intensive care, rare events are important, but if we don't get together, we will not get enough of these rare events really to have meaningful thinking and conversations about it. So PhysioNet was one of the first examples to bring possibility of knowledge to others, sharing a database from Mimic, and really I think we need to do this also. If we do this, Derek was telling us almost 10 years ago that actually artificial intelligence can even help us, for instance, to tackle some of the hurdles of clinical trials. Clinical trials are important. I think it's important to randomize patients, but the problem now is that we randomize such a heterogeneous group of patients for the same treatment that is not surprised that 9 out of 10 trials are basically ending up negative. So what can we do? Probably we need to use this technology, so using big data for big trials, going to find and identify phenotypes and subphenotypes. But let's be careful. There is a limit also to that. There is a point where the subphenotype becomes the individual patient, and probably we are not there yet then to get any important information on treatment that we can do that. But imagine about stratifying better, imagine about having networks that talk in real time, that identify a phenotype, and then a trigger comes out and said, we should randomize this patient to this treatment. So we are moving from identifying a syndrome to a disease to a specific phenotype for one patient. And so the vision, and I think we need to be visionary and push this imagination now, is that at some point we will have self-learning systems, so healthcare systems that learn while we are working, while we are doing things, potentially fine-tuning more and more what we call a digital twin. Digital twin of a patient, digital twin maybe of the organization of the ICU, maybe a digital twin of a full healthcare system. Sound maybe science fiction now, but I think if we push in this direction, it will be possible. And also we need to have rigorous methodology on how we test artificial intelligence into our practice. So are we really testing artificial intelligence, or are we finally testing an algorithm that is making compliance to very old therapy possible? So it's opening new fields, new ideas. And again, we should be very careful also to remember that artificial intelligence can only analyze what is digital data. If we stop actually thinking what could be important, and we don't put that into data, then we may make mistakes. Think about the ambient light in our intensive care units. Maybe that has a bigger role than some other organizational factor for delirium or for the experience of patients. We're not recording that yet. So, there are also some pitfalls in research. Again, we should be optimistic, but we shouldn't take this without understanding that we need to understand really how to study and how to bring into clinical practice. And I'll pass the word to Azra now.
You were doing great, Maurizio. You could continue. Well, thank you for having me. Well, obviously somebody has to do the work, and I think it's all of us. That brings us to the challenge that our workforce really span multiple generations, from digitally native younger to those who were born without computers. So I think we have to not only change the way how we train our medical professionals, but also completely upskill or maybe even reskill our existing workforce. For that, I think societies play huge roles, together with the universities, to create programs that will be widely open and accessible for entire workforce across the world. And we probably will call action in that regard from all societies. Great. Now, okay, how to start? I think this is not an easy question to answer. I think for us that will be probably the focus of the first paper we want to talk about. I think we all agree data is the key. Without digitalized data, there is no AI. In medicine, acquiring data is probably becoming more widespread. However, what type of data we are collecting might change, because the data that we currently have, clinical data, may not be enough. We want to go deeper. We want to be wider. We want to resemble human intelligence more. That means that we need to collect multisensory data. However, even data that we have collected so far is not standardized. Even in the United States, it's very hard to integrate the data from different institutions. That data standardization, interoperability, and harmonization is probably the first step that we have to strive towards. Creating common data language and model for the ICU-specific data is really important. If you ever have worked in an EHR, you know the flow sheet from ICU is extremely non-standardized and difficult to annotate. So I think that's the first job we have to do. How do you build infrastructure that will require buy-in from really healthcare organization? AI is expensive business. You will need not only high-performance computing, but you also need to wire your hospital. I always say that current hospital is iPhone 2, you need to be on iPhone 15. So we have a way to go. Aligning cost reduction and outcome improvement with AI will be not a simple task. I expect that we will start with low-hanging fruit, like operational efficiencies, and really making our job easier, not being the slaves of EHR, but really use them to full potentials. And then again, integrating clinical and research data really towards research commons, something that cancer has done very well. If you ever have a chance, go to NIH, Cancer Research Common is fantastic. Ethical societal implications will be huge. I don't think, if you think that healthcare is not ready, I don't think society is ready for AI. And a lot of very important questions, both for educational field and healthcare in front of us. We need to ensure fairness. We need to also address bias and safety of AI. I think that our field is the most important field to address safety. And I expect that we as physicians have to play a key role in that. We said also critical care is currently confined to the physical constraints of intensive care units walls. But does it really belong there? Do we need to go beyond before and after? And I really believe we do. We have launched mobile stroke unit at the University of Florida, bringing really CTs and thrombolytic therapy in the neighborhoods, and it was a huge hit. And I can only expect that we may see things like that more and more, and then we can integrate the data from the field, from the moment you come in someone's house or neighborhood, till the moment they hit the ICU, and then go beyond that. You send them home. You really have to do the hard job of recovery. And I expect that intensivists will start realizing that we are part of the bigger picture, not one small brief episode in ICU. Again, universal health coverage was a World Health Day topic back in 2018, and then we have a pandemic hit us hard and remind us that we are part of one big system, so we need to continue to be system thinker and think about everything that is behind AI still exists, and we cannot move medicine forward without moving those fundamental problems in medicine in parallel with AI. We also need patient-centered, global, inclusive approach. You know, we are on the crossroads of our civilization when we need to understand, is it going to be AI-enabled world or AI-dominated world? And I like to think that AI will make us superhumans. And I call it human plus vision, where you can think about this technology, biotechnology, really enhancing humans' capacity. So that brings us to conclusion. Like, we had 2 days of really intense discussion, amazing talks, and then like we need to think about what now. So what will be the first output of all of this? We thought maybe we can write a letter to our future self from us, right? Because a lot of us, maybe 10 years from now, will be people who were born at the time that looked so different. So we need to understand what is our why. Why do we want to bring AI to healthcare? And we think that AI really may have, if used properly and if we are capable of doing this right, we might really transform the way how we practice and experience medicine, both as the physicians and patients. And really, we put the first principle of our vision is that this is a human-centered healthcare. Human-centered, AI-enabled healthcare. And for that, you have to be data-driven and AI-powered. We also want to have acute care. You can see here, I don't use critical care. I said acute care, thinking about continuum without borders. We also want to be aligned with responsible AI for social and ethical healthcare framework, meaning we want to focus on enhancing patient care, supporting healthcare professionals, and be accessible and safe for all. And we also have to be approved not only by the legal, but also by social license. That means society has to approve what we are doing. This is really important. What is needed, you can see it's a long list of things that will be needed, and I think we need to have a widespread stakeholder engagement in soliciting ideas and approaches how to do this, right? Policy and advocacy, how we reach the community and get public engagement in this, understanding legal, ethical, and societal framework, especially in acute care, where patient is often stripped of their autonomy because of the complexity of their illness. We need to think about workforce education reform and upskilling programs that need to be global and accessible all over the world, about data sharing standards and interoperability, again, across the globe. Algorithms that need to abide for certain rules. I think they need to be trustworthy, reproducible, sustainable, and ethical, and follow the same scientific rigor we use for everything else. The computational infrastructure will be a huge problem. We need to think about digital divide, who will have a GPUs in the quantities you really need to train models like that. And we need to also think about which hospital will be able to really be wired with the iPhone 15 version. And again, I think we can't do this alone. This is a too big problem. It is too expensive, and I think partnership with industry will be more critical than ever. So that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Azra, and thank you, Maurizio. And we are moving now to the next presentation, and I'm delighted to invite Professor Sharon Einav-Bromiker from Tel Aviv on the conflict between evidence-based medicine and personalized medicine.
So, okay, good. Oh, now it's gone. Okay, so quite a challenging topic, I have to say, and in order to do that, I had to go, believe it or not, back rather than forward. And the reason that I am on this stage is that I am going to annoy most of you by the end of the day, probably, So if I've done that, I've done what I've set out to do with this talk. So are we doing evidence-based medicine, and are we actually practicing personalized medicine? I think that in fact, we're using evidence-based medicine as a sort of comfortable couch to believe in the certainty of what we're doing. And I'm going to show you why this comfortable couch isn't actually so comfortable, and why we're actually doing something that's probably quite different than evidence-based medicine. So first of all, this is the number of decisions, thank you Derek for this slide, that we're making on a daily basis during rounds. We're making approximately 100 decisions during 4-hour rounds, and if you take this to 24 hours, then that means we're probably performing about 250 decisions daily. So all of these decisions are probably event-based, complex combinations of decisions. Decision-making doesn't follow a linear process. This doesn't sound like evidence-based medicine. The evidence, however, is at our fingertips, in theory. We've got this fantastic tool here called PubMed, which we could use from the National Library of Medicine. The only problem is that it's cumbersome, it's about 20 years old, and it's not very quick. We could also Google for evidence, but the only problem is that Google is getting worse, and what we could once find with one button, we now need to actually have several scrolling down screens in order to probably find something of what we need. We could look it up in a textbook, or not, because the textbooks are old, they're not updated, and they're way too heavy. We're not going to be carrying them around in real time. So my first point is, ICU doctors make decisions all the time for patients without seeking evidence in real time. And don't kid me to believe that you have everything in your brain. We're not that smart. So I'm going to continue with some more data sources that my students keep citing. UpToDate addresses diseases rather than patients. We know it doesn't solve our complex ICU problems. It's revised whenever important new information is published. Who decides what's important? It reviews 440 patients. That's written proudly on the website. But look at the number of journals up to 2016. Okay, it's more than 47,000 nowadays, and these are the numbers, and also the number of papers in each journal is increasing. UpToDate also has a bit of a problem with whether the recommendation is related to the actual certainty. If you're looking at data of moderate certainty, it can come out as a weak or a strong recommendation. So they're using GRADE, right? Now, who else is using GRADE? We have the guidelines. Guidelines we should definitely follow because that is evidence-based. So I'm going to say guidelines are a great start. I'm not saying don't follow the guidelines. Guidelines are a good start. You need to have that like, this is sort of baseline, the lowest common denominator that we should start with. But guidelines contain many best practice statements, and a best practice statement is made when there is insufficient evidence. So, is that recommendation better than what we would spontaneously think? Some people, some very smart people, actually said it's not clear that the opinion of a conscientious, judicious, well-educated, and experienced clinician would necessarily be inferior to GRADE. Okay, so there you go. If you're smart, you might actually be good as a guideline. Guidelines are also based on meta-analysis, so that definitely makes them better, right? And that means that we are not making individualized decisions here. We're only doing evidence-based medicine. In this report, which is the most recent report in 2005 on the quality of meta-analyses in critical care, the overall quality was poor. Very, very old paper. So look at Cochrane. Cochrane has 9,000 or more reviews. I'm part of Cochrane. I'm kind of proud of what we're doing. I think we're doing great work. But specifically, and I can tell you this is right now because I got this data from Cochrane Central yesterday, we have emergency and critical care, 145 reviews, Injuries, 180 reviews. There's one more in the making. Anesthesia, 162. So there goes your trusted evidence for informed decisions. It's about yay much of about this much. So meta-analyses are also very demanding. It takes about 2 years to do that. It takes a whole lot of experts. We literally don't have the time and the manpower to do this. And if we choose to rely on non-Cochrane meta-analyses, well, you know, there's a bunch of papers showing that poor search methods, changes in an outcome exist, the change in the actual PICO components that are not outcomes, not to mention inherent biases that are part of meta-analyses that are publication bias and poor quality of trials. Somewhere in our gut, we must know that, and I'll show you why. We all know you can sit through piles of papers and never find a gold quality RCT. And then some people will say, oh, this is a good trial, and others will say no. Intensive care journals endorse the consort statement, but there is insufficient evidence to determine the relation between journals' endorsement and the actual quality and completement of reporting. So that needs to be studied as well. We do feel something when we make that decision about our patient to choose this trial rather than that trial. A lot of times when the same question gets asked again and again, study size grows, quality improves, effect disappears. And we have to make that decision at the bedside, whether we like it or not. This was actually discussed more than 10 years ago in this, in the New Yorker. So I'm telling you nothing new here. And in fact, as clinicians, what we've seen, and this is already another very old paper, is a decade of reversal. Anything that you were already doing and you're trying to prove is very hard to prove again. And anything that you're bringing in new is probably going to be easier to prove. And why is that? It's really all about statistics, and that brings me in a minute to AI as well. Because, and this comes from a textbook of statistics, this is like epidemiology 101. Anything that you do, if you perform 2 studies with a different distribution of the population effect, you will find that only 50% of the time, that's random chance, you are getting the same response, the same result. And besides, we're assuming that clinical trials are cost effective. So we've heard here in this very session at the beginning that we need to move forward with better clinical trials. But the very assumptions on which we understand that clinical trials are worthwhile are misassumptions. So this is a original, like the paper by Arthur Detsky, showing his model assumptions, and I'm showing them as limitations. So his first assumption is that a clinical intervention will either be completely adopted or not adopted at all. So how long does it take us to adopt a new guideline? About 17 years. Okay? There are a couple of papers showing this may have shortened in the last few years, but there's a reason. There's resistance out there to rapid adoption. And it's not just the fact that we're human, it's the fact that we kind of tend to be suspicious. So the second assumption, or the third assumption, are that the scientific quality of the trials are high, I've already discussed that, and that the study has a hard endpoint. But we already know that we're not really interested in hard endpoints. When you're looking at what is meaningful for patients, it's not necessarily mortality, which is the bottom of the list. And you know, I can go back to Emily Dickinson, who actually described this way back, saying that it's the quality of death that matters and not the very death. So that isn't medicine. She knew it, we know it, our patient know it. This isn't evidence-based, but we're doing it. The fourth and fifth assumptions are that there's a simple proportional relationship between sample size and trial costs, and that agency charges actually reflect actual costs. And we know that any trial above 300 to 500 patients is actually more expensive, has less quality results, and is less likely to find an outcome. And that calculation was actually performed by industry, because they wanted to know how many patients it's worthwhile to recruit into multi-center trials. So literally, it's not worth their while, and we simply cannot afford a clinical trial for each of those 100 medical dilemmas that we have every day during those 4 hours. And finally, even when we have a trial, this was mentioned earlier on, this is the graveyard of clinical trials. We just keep adding on and on to them. And now we understand why. We've got a great new tool, I would even say a great new toy, and it's platform or pragmatic trials. I'm not going to give a separate talk here about platform trials, okay? They're observational, mostly open label, they're susceptible to temporal effects, you perform a posteriori adjustment. So, you know, you can have people, I can tell you clinical trials for me is sort of like a little black dress. It's always there, but the fashion changes. So we always wear it because we know that's going to look good, but it is a fad. So in fact, causation is interpretation. It is not an entity, okay? And I think this is the bottom line. And we as clinicians understand that. So my second point is, the evidence is there, but it's kind of meh. The third, so now I'm getting on to the last part. How are we going to use clinical trials, and how does that interpret into our practice? And does that keep us back? So here is what Archie Cochrane said. You know, this is you really should read this guy's history. It's one of the most fascinating histories in how he reached his conclusions. So he says, I believe the RCT suitably applied may have a similar effect. He was discussing something that Freud did in producing an effective, efficient health service. And I'm saying, what is suitably applying? We are actually suitably applying RCTs every day in our practice. What we're doing is exactly what Maurizio was saying before. We're applying the Austin-Bradford Hill criteria. We're looking at strength of association, at consistency, at specificity, at temporality. It's unbelievable how many trials have had mistakes in temporality and had the effect attributed to the actual intervention when it wasn't right temporally. Plausibility, and so on. So I'm saying we are going sort of in the right direction. We're doing this on a daily basis. We're not letting RCTs keep us back. Meanwhile, RCTs are kind of trying to catch up. We've moved from environment, demographics, sex, age, phenotypes. We're sort of like, this is the new thing, phenotyping, and we're looking into the next part, which is omics. As Fabio will probably mention in another talk, we're talking about radiomics, genomics, physiognomics. We're all going in that direction, but you know, this is all pointing in one direction, and whether we like it or not, we're going to be going to the individual. And I don't agree with Maurizio here before that said we need to be careful, because the individual is the solution. And individualized medicine really is at the tips of our fingers. We're doing it daily. And there's a reason that at the tips of our fingers, none of us has the same fingerprint. Why on earth, if we don't have a similar fingerprint, should we behave differently should we behave similarly when we are septic? We can use augmented intelligence to do that. This is the real revolution. It's coming up. There's no question about it. We're still talking about data in ICU. I think the real thing is going to be following us, looking at what we're doing on a daily basis, using large language models. Finally, we'll end up where we started. And this is what David Sackett said. Excellent external evidence may be inapplicable to or inappropriate for an individual patient. We know that. We're practicing that. We're actually not limiting ourselves only to the evidence. It's the evidence that's chasing after us. So does evidence-based medicine limit the practice of personalized medicine? No. It complements it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sharon. This is already a fantastic session, and we're moving to another really fascinating talk. I would like to invite up Nicole Hunfeld from Erasmus University, from Erasmus Hospital Center in Rotterdam, who's going to speak to us about how we can get towards making a green ICU.
Yes, good morning everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to tell my story about the Green ICU in the Netherlands and how we started and where we are now. And for me, and I'm a hospital pharmacist in the ICU, and keen on a sustainable medication process, and this changed a bit during COVID. The ICU smelled like plastic, we had waste all over the place. I was walking in the ICU, talking to the head of the department, and I think 1 second we looked at each other and we said, oh, all these bins with plastic waste. We are helping patients, but we are not helping the environment. And at home, my kids were challenging me. Mom, why are you buying plastic stuff at the supermarket? What's happening to the planet? What's happening to our generation? So they really keep me motivated, and they also inspired me. Starting this whole green ICU movement. And one other thing really helped me and still does. There's a former nurse in the Netherlands. She had breast cancer and she needed surgery, but she's used to make pieces of art out of waste. So she asked the surgeon to keep her waste from her surgery, and I would like to share what she did with it. She ends with the question, it was in Dutch, can this be done in a different way? And she means a more sustainable way. So I'd like to give you some numbers, because I think we've got some work to do that together. The healthcare sector is responsible for 4 to 7% of the CO2 footprint worldwide. And I think we already know that the climate crisis is also a health crisis. Because of all these greenhouse gas emissions, temperature is rising, the globe. We have flooding, heat strokes, and pandemic outbreaks. In the Netherlands, we are one of the countries that touch the 7%. This means, if you look at the ICU bed there, 7 bags of waste per patient per day. This is what we use in my ICU. This is just reality, what you are seeing there. From a more broad perspective, in the Netherlands, healthcare causes 4% of the total waste. We use 7% of the land to make all the products that we use, 8% of water and 13% of raw materials, which are being scarce at the moment. What this bed shows means that we use 108 gloves per patient per day, 57 compressors or gauzes, 34 infusion bags with medication and packaging, 24 syringes filled with medication, packaging, and 8 absorption mats 16 gowns, etc. This adds up to 17 kilograms of products per day per patient, which equals 12 kilograms of CO2 emissions. This is approximately 54 kilometers by car. So for our 40 patients, it's 2,000 kilometers per day per car, by car. If you look at the CO2 emissions for the whole ICU, only for the products, then I don't talk about the building itself, the ICU, the lights, electricity, etc. For all these products, we use 4 square meters of land and 300 liters of water. And how do we know these data? In 2020, we performed a material flow analysis, together with a company specialized in environmental analysis. And what we did is we measured all the inputs in the ICU, shown on the left side, like energy, water, and materials. And we decided to focus on materials, because this is something we can change as healthcare professionals. And we also measured the output. So the water that is used, the waste, the products, etc., and the CO2 emissions. And we were able to show this in a graph, helped by the company. And this is a typical way of showing a material flow of an environmental process. On the left side, you can see all the products or the materials that we use for here. So water, hydrochloric acid, glass, medicine, ingredients, etc. It's used for the products in the middle, like medicines, disposables, cleaning, textiles. Then it touches the ICU and the patients. Then it goes over to sewage and incineration. This is a simplified version that we published in Intensive Care Medicine, because the real version was a bit too difficult. I will show it right now. This is what it really is. Meaning that we used in 1 year 250,000 kilograms of products. We measured them all based on data from our bio department. So we combined all these data. And what this shows us is that we used 14 different types of plastic. It's impossible to recycle those because it's not pure plastic, it's a mix. We cannot ask nurses to divide this into waste streams. So this is a real problem for the ICU. What we noticed as well, that lots of the water comes from the infusion bags and the CRT bags that we use. It's enormous. And also PP used in the gowns, fluff pulp comes from wood, from trees, used in the absorption mats, etc. With this graph, we started a discussion with the nurses. Like, this is what happens in our ICU. Do you think you can change this? And where are we going to start? Because this also revealed our hotspots in the ICU. We said, okay, if we have the data now, then we should publish them. So that's what we did. And this paper on the left side in Isicem can help you as well. It contains a low-hanging fruit of the interventions that you can do in your ICU. Also, we said, okay, we now know the hotspots, it's time for action. And that's what we have written in the paper on the right side. It's all open access, and we really would like you to read it and to use it for your own ICU. And in the meantime, when we were analyzing the data and we started a discussion with the nursing staff, we started also our own green team. And this is a dynamic group, it's still there. We have a meeting every 2 weeks, and everybody that wants to join is more than welcome. So we are there with nurses, assisting nurses, technicians, a management delegate, the quality officer, students, interns, intensivists, infection prevention colleagues, pharmacists, and people that would like to join or are running a project in the ICU. We also have our annual plan with strict goals, and we communicate a lot about it, and we also organize fun events. And we have a very ambitious mission. We really want to make the shift from a linear to a circular system, meaning that in 2030 we would like to be our ICU 100% circular. But how do you do this? We started with a big chunk, dialysis bags. We have many of those, 12 per patient per day. We often have 10 patients on CRT, so it's a lot of plastic. We asked the student from our technical university, from industrial design, please help us out, and can you please redesign a recycling process for our ICU? And that's what she did. We first analyzed the bags. These are the ones from Fresenius, and they are made out of polypropylene. It's the same like the blue wraps in the OR. and that material can easily be recycled. She then calculated that it's 14% of our waste stream. So this makes impact. And if you look at it from an environmental perspective on the left side, this saves 22,000 kilograms of CO2. That's 160 flights from Amsterdam to Paris just for one ICU for a year. So this makes sense. Then she discussed with the nursing staff, okay, how can we do this? What is needed to make this a separate stream? And we also wanted to make sure that it's not additional work for the nursing staff. So we do this in co-creation session together with the student. And then she made this sign on the left side, collection sign. We added special standards in our waste room, and then we started collecting. Everybody needed some time to get used to it, because the connectors have to be taken off with a special knife. But in the end, now I think we're months further, it works. These bags are full every day. The logistical department collects them, and they're being brought to a special company in the Netherlands where it is where they recycle them. They make pellets out of it, can be used in new products. And we did something else. We set up a national paracetamol challenge. Because I saw in the ICU that many patients get intravenous paracetamol, but can often be changed into tablets. So we made a poster showing the environmental effects on the left side, it's in Dutch, of tablets, but IV also, etc. And then we made a LinkedIn message challenging other hospitals to make this 25% reduction from intravenous to oral into tablets. We also said, if you achieve this goal, you're welcome to come to Erasmus Medical Center. You can pick up this big, huge paracetamol, take it to your own hospital, make a movie, share it, and inspire other hospitals. And at the moment, this paracetamol is on its way to the 6th hospital in the Netherlands, and it's making its tour. One other thing that we did on national level is we have our Green ICU network in the Netherlands, which has its own website, and we share tips, tricks, and best practices. The website has the link www.degoneic.nl. If you use Google Translate, you can use all our tips and tricks. Translation is quite okay, I can tell you, because we tested it with many colleagues in Europe. So feel free to use it and be inspired by it. And then I would like to finish with a special message, because I told you about my children, and when I told them that I was going to Brussels, they said, there's a lot of intensivists there. We have a special message for them.
Hello, I'm Nora and I'm 8 years old. I want to tell you a little something. We want to tell you to keep the world clean. Don't take the car but the subway. If your child has to sport on Saturday, do carpool or go with one big bus, or take the bicycle or the subway instead of a car. Please make the world green. If that does not happen, what is going to happen with us? Please save our future.
Hello, I am Willem and I am 10 years old. I would like to ask you to recycle plastic at home and don't consume too much. You, as doctors, use a lot of plastic and medication. Please think about our planet. Every time you use plastic or prescribe medication. If we continue like this, our grandchildren will no longer be able to experience a green world. There's only one world, and we have to make sure that we take care of it together. Please help our generation and take care of our planet.
So go green and make fun.
Thank you very much. This session is really amazing. And we move to the next presentation. I'm very happy to invite Luregn Schlapbach from Switzerland to lecture on gene expression signatures in children with sepsis. Thank you very much.
Bonjour, good morning, and thank you so much, Professor Jean-Louis Vincent, for this invitation. You have just heard why children are important and that children are the future, and so it is a real pleasure actually to have a pediatric slot in this morning of this amazing conference. I will present a paper here on behalf of the Rapid Pediatric Infection Diagnosis in Sepsis study, and would like to thank already all the investigators of this team that have made this possible. This will be a presentation as a late breaker on a paper coming out today in the Lancet Child Adolescent Health. Then there's a number of disclosures in relation to grounds for this study and other grounds, but no other conflicts of interest they have to disclose. So when you look at the sepsis burden globally, there's about 50% of cases, so roughly 25 million, based on the global burden of disease study, affect pediatric age groups. This results in about 3 million deaths every year, but most the children that survive of sepsis, actually, they have decades ahead of them. And so the impact on the society, is huge. However, actually, if you contrast this with our current approaches, and we've just heard the troubles with evidence-based versus precision medicine, if you look at how we do this at the bedside, we're still very, very conventional. And we've just published 2 months ago in JAMA the new criteria for pediatric sepsis, which I see lots of progress from. However, actually, we have to be very frank here. These criteria do not permit us to recognize the disease early. We cannot predict which children will actually get sick. And more importantly, and this is an issue that has been criticized with the Surviving Sepsis Campaign guidelines too, is when we suspect sepsis, we should launch a treatment bundle including antibiotics. We already know from adults that mandates for sepsis care have been criticized because they may lead to overtreatment. But in pediatrics, actually the epidemiology is even different. Most children that come to emergency departments, they have viral infections. So how do you recognize that the child on the top right will actually progress to the child on the bottom right? Because at the moment there's a huge risk that sepsis campaigns, as much as I support them, that they may lead to inadvertent excessive use of antibiotics. And finally as well, and this is maybe an even more dramatic challenge in children, our understanding of the underlying biology is still actually fairly limited, which then of course actually limits our approaches to improve care. And you've just heard before, 20 years ago, APC, and at this stage, we still actually really lack personalized interventions for kids. But so let's take this back to the concept of sepsis, based on the sepsis 3 definition. So essentially, we have to characterize sepsis by 3 dimensions. So there is a trigger, which is infection or suspected infection, but we already know that that's just not one trigger. There are at least 2 broad groups, such as bacterial or viral. And of course, that's a simplification because each of these groups may have different pathogens, right? And there are some cases such as, cardiac bypass surgery, which may lead to something that can look very similar, but actually the trigger is different. And this then leads to a dysregulated host response, which to this date actually has been very little characterized, which in the end results in organ dysfunction, which we measure through different types of organ dysfunction scores, such as the Phoenix score in kids or the SOFA score in adults. But at the moment, actually, most approaches to sepsis and sepsis diagnostics so far focused very much in terms of severity, actually, on just characterizing severity by organ dysfunction scores. But we do not really understand the host response behind it. So what we've done in these studies, we recruited 907 children across 4 hospitals, mainly emergency departments, some ICUs in Australia. And we included children where clinicians had a suspicion of infection or sepsis, which was strong enough that they said, I'm going to take blood cultures in this patient. And in addition, then we asked the clinicians to sample PAX gene as well. We've isolated in batched an RNA, did RNA sequencing, which gives a very high coverage actually of the transcripts analyzed. And we put it through a bioinformatic analysis, which is called, forward selection partial least squares, which essentially allows for patients to be in different types of classes. So a patient, for example, can be in one type of infection class, or in bacterial or viral infection or no infection, but at the same time the patient can be in severity groups, so low severity or high severity, right? And in order to do so, we split off about 2/3 of this cohort into a discovery cohort, and we had 2 clinicians independently assessing post-hoc, actually the phenotypes of these patients. Along 2 axes. So one was the type of infection axis, so we classified them on microbiologically confirmed versus viral infection. We had as well categories of probable infection, and of course as well there were some patients who were not infected or uncertain. And on the other hand, we categorized them based on whether they had at time of presentation, but then more importantly 24 hours after presentation, whether they had organ dysfunction. And we used the organ dysfunction criteria based on the 2005 pediatric sepsis criteria. So we did not look at the SIRS criteria because we know, and we've shown this too, they're pretty much useless, but we used the criteria for specific organ dysfunction such as liver, brain, respiratory, renal, and so on. Based on these, then actually we generated disease class signatures for the type of infection and the disease severity signature to predict severity in 24 hours, and we evaluate the signatures through areas on that curve. In the next step, then actually we progressed to validation of this in 2 different cohorts. One of them was the third of patients from the RAPIDS cohort not included in the discovery. And the second one was an external European cohort, Euclids, which was led by Mike Lewine and team from Imperial College 8 years ago throughout different European centers. And so what we then did is we first applied this disease class signature to say, okay, we think this patient has a predicted viral infection as opposed to a predicted bacterial infection. And then we applied the disease severity signature to actually say, is this patient likely to be really sick in 24 hours in terms of organ dysfunction or not? And you can see here now some overview of the clinical cohort, so it's probably a bit small on the right top, but essentially, so we have a total cohort sample, including the validation cohorts of over 1,200 patients, all of whom have undergone full RNA sequencing. This is a classic pediatric emergency type cohort. So the overall acuity in terms of death is low. There's about 1 in 5 that go to ICU. There's about 1 in 4 that have chronic conditions. Most of these kids are young infants, up to sort of 2 or 3 years of age. Most of them present actually with fever. And as you can see, actually there's a bit more than a third that had some types of bacterial infection, about one third that had viral infections. What's important to see here, and that's really different from adult studies, or many published adult studies, is that the time from presentation to hospital to actually to sampling was very short. It was around 2 to 3 hours. And this is important because a lot of the severity work done so far around gene expression signatures, and I'll show some of the signatures published today. They focus on heavily ICU-focused cohorts. They have mortality as an outcome, and often these patients have been sick, often for days, which when you talk about severity, biologically may be something very, very different to a patient that has just come to your ED, 1 or 2 hours ago. The first step, which is often done in these types of gene expression studies, you do what is called a volcano plot. And what you can see here, so essentially we split the discovery cohort and looked into top left gene expression for bacterial versus viral. And you can see that there are over 800 very differentially expressed genes. And these are different from, as you can see on the top right, when we then look at patients that are severely ill 24 hours later or not. Over 1,000 genes were differently expressed. But we know that, and that's been one of the challenges in previous gene expression work, that there is often a severity bias because bacterial infections tend to be more severe than viral infections. And so previous signatures probably had a bit of a confounding by severity. And this approach now, as you can see on the bottom 2 graphs, then allows actually to tease out which children with a bacterial infection actually were really sick as opposed to them. And these were different genes involved. And so we then developed a 10-gene disease class signature, which can discriminate definitive bacterial from viral infection. And as you can see here on the right, the area under the curve plot, actually the performance is really good as well in the validation cohort with areas on the curve of above 90%, right? Similarly, we developed a 10-gene disease severity signature, which is optimized for predicting if organ dysfunction was present in 24 hours. And that's important because although many of these kids have organ dysfunction on presentation, some actually will get worse and some actually will be okay tomorrow, because they come in, they have a little bit of high creatinine because they've been dehydrated and so on, but the next day they may be fine. And as you can see here, and that's actually been a consistent finding, which I do think has methodological implications, this is harder to validate. So we've had a drop in about 10% of performance, we're still well above 80%. But interestingly, and I think this is now where the clinical utility actually gets more into focus, when we combined the type of infection and the severity signatures, we got as well in the validation cohorts areas on the curve above 90%. And I think that's sort of the interesting aspect that we can say, well, this child is likely to have a bacterial infection and be sick, tomorrow. I'm not going to go into detail of the genes, but you can see here a comparison of our signature with previously published signatures. As you can see, a lot of the type of infection signatures were relatively simple, and this contrasts with signatures that have been published on severity, some of which actually were extremely complicated and complex. And if you look at the pathways, now let's, if we try and understand actually what do these signatures really reflect, then our disease class signatures, had a strong focus on pathways that relate to the immune system. Whereas the disease severity signature already was a bit more scattered around, but it had a strong focus around the signal transduction. But if you compare our signatures with previously published signatures, you can see it gets actually pretty messy. Whereas the type of infection actually, is strongly centered around the immune system. That's something consistent, right? And so if we benchmark now the novel signature against these previously published signatures, and I think it's important, that has not really done much. A lot of gene expression papers have used multi-array, not RNA sequencing. A lot of these cohorts were actually adult and not kids cohort, except for, for the Herbert paper, for example, here, or Hector Wong's paper. But you can see actually the disease type signature performed very well across the validation data sets and was, similar or superior actually to previously published signatures. Interesting, when you look at the disease severity signature, the performance is still quite good. It's above 80% for most comparisons. However, actually it varies more, and I'm going to talk briefly about why that could be. The other interesting thing here is actually some of these signatures, for example, the Bagela signatures, they were derived in adults. And that poses some really interesting questions for the future as to which of these concepts are transferable. If we move down the precision medicine alley, we have a real problem in pediatrics because of smaller numbers, and we will be really dependent to know what adult concepts are transferable to kids. But there's a real other problem with severity because we don't have a gold standard. We can't say, okay, this patient has a confirmed staphylococcal bacteremic patient. Biologically, I'm absolutely certain is something really different from the child with RSV bronchiolitis. But both may have organ dysfunction. But if you compare 4 types of validated organ dysfunction scores for kids, the agreement across them as to who has organ dysfunction not is only about 57%, right? So we have a problem actually with how do we train such models if there's no true gold standard, because we don't actually see mortality as a good gold standard, certainly not for kids. And so what we have done is we created essentially parallel or secondary, ancillary, secondary outcomes. For example, did this child have organ dysfunction remote from the site of infection? Or did this child develop multi-organ dysfunction? Or did this child need organ support therapies? And as you can see, actually, the performance in the validation data set sort of was around the 80%. So that, and I'm not sure if the variability in performance here is actually that the signature is not good enough, or it is because the outcome maybe is not good enough. And so this is essentially the summary. So if we try and combine the type of infection with the prediction of if patients will be sick due to bacterial as opposed to due to viral infection, as you can see here, actually, we achieve really, really high performance, which is superior actually to many of the previously published signatures. And so this essentially leads us to, what does this show us, or what could that mean to? So at the moment, as mentioned, we don't really have a personalized diagnosis of sepsis. And a lot of the personalization that is at the moment key in ICU literature refers more to what should you do to the patient with multi-organ dysfunction in your ICU where you're afraid the patient may die, right? But if we take it a step earlier into the early stage of disease, what you actually want to know is what is the trigger behind what this child has? Do I really need antibiotics? So this is actionable information. And should I anticipate that this child will deteriorate and end up needing organ support, if I'm in a small facility? Should I consider actually transferring this patient out, right? There was some strength in this approach. So, using whole RNA sequencing provides much bigger breadth and depth compared to multi-array. In principle, 2x10 signatures should be translatable to a point-of-care test. But these were not RT-PCR-based signature testing, and we have not validated them at the bedside. So we can't really comment on is this going to make a change to what doctors do. And although we think this is early sampling, actually, these kids have been sick for some days at home, right? So it will be really challenging to really identify patients who come to your ED who die the next day, because these patients are very rare, but these are the ones we want to capture. And finally as well, although the study was large, the subgroups actually get really small, which again, makes an important call for international collaboration, right? And with that, I would like to thank all the collaborators, in particular David Kahn, Claire Wilson, Lachlan Cohen, Kristen Gibbons. I would like to thank the Euclid's Consortium, Michael Lewen, who gave us access, and in particular, the children and the families who consented to be part of this study. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Luregn, and congratulations to you and your co-authors on this fantastic, huge and really elegant study, which, as you noted, has just been published in The Lancet, I believe, right as we speak. And indeed, that's a feature, I think, for all of the remaining talks in this session. So we are getting a frontline view on what are going to be a set of 4 amazing papers. The next one of which is going to be presented by Frederik Nielsen, entitled Effect of Lower versus Higher Oxygenation Targets Experience in COVID-19. And just to be clear, these are going to be short presentations. The papers will be online. We're not going to be taking any questions. So.
Yes, so hello, my name is Frederik, and I'm very happy to be here to present the results of the hot COVID trial on behalf of the entire trial group. So very briefly, the trial was funded by an unrestricted grant from the Danish Ministry of Higher Education and Science, and it was sponsor-initiated by Bo Steen Rasmussen from Aalborg University Hospital. So, patients admitted to an ICU with hypoxemia and COVID-19 need supplemental oxygen treatment, but we haven't found the optimal dose. This was the case at the start of the pandemic, with no published evidence from clinical trials, and it has remained the case throughout the pandemic, with still no published trials. This has also been reflected in the clinical guidelines that have recommended a general SpO2 target from 92 to 96%, but based on data extrapolated from non-COVID populations. So, in this aspect, the aim of the hot COVID trial was to provide evidence on how to target oxygen for COVID-19 patients in the ICU. So here's the aim, very simply put up as a PICO. We looked at ICU patients with COVID-19 hypoxemia. Our intervention was an arterial partial pressure of oxygen of 8 kilopascals. Our control was a target of 12. And our primary outcome was days alive without life support, where we defined life support as mechanical ventilation, circulatory support, or renal replacement therapy. So it's nice to have more days alive without life support. The trial is an amendment to the hot ICU trial protocol, but it's very important to note that no patients participated in both trials. It was conducted in 5 European countries in 13 ICUs. It started in August 2020 and ended in March 23. What we did was basically, we took adult patients with COVID-19 and hypoxemia, randomized them within 12 hours from ICU admission to either the 8 kilopascal target or the 12 kilopascal target. Then we maintained these targets as long as patients were admitted to a participating ICU, including readmissions, for up to 90 days. And at 90 days, we looked at our outcomes, being days alive without life support, all-cause mortality, days alive out of hospital, and then new episodes of serious adverse events in the ICU. We have also planned and almost completed a 1-year follow-up looking at mortality, cognitive function, and lung function. So, inclusion criteria were basically that they had to be adults with COVID-19, acutely admitted to an ICU, in need of oxygen for at least 24 hours, and with a flow of at least 10 liters in an open system or any fraction of oxygen in a closed system. Then they all had to have an arterial line to monitor the PO2, and it's important to note that that is completely standard of care in all participating ICUs. Exclusion criteria are a bit more comprehensive, but basically they concern condition, diseases, or treatments that could directly influence the intervention effect, or legal or ethical matters. We randomized 726 patients out of those 780 we had planned based on our power calculation. So the trial was stopped early. And as you can see, we had a stagnation point around the winter of 22 that corresponded completely to the emergence of the Omicron variant. And we actually ran the trial for a whole another year just to be sure that it wouldn't change again. But in the end, it didn't, and we stopped it. It's important to say that we didn't look at any data prior to making the decision. So we screened 786, randomized 726 with 365 in the higher group and 361 in the lower group. No, sorry, opposite. So 365 in the lower and 361 in the higher. At 90 days, we had complete data on all outcomes for 351 in the lower and 346 in the higher. So a missingness of 4%. At baseline, the two groups were balanced. And just to briefly describe the patients that we have in the trial, they were about 65 years, predominantly male. They had diseases in the lungs like pneumonia or ARDS as diagnosed by clinicians. They had quite few coexisting illnesses. The most frequent one was ischemic heart disease at about 10%. A fourth was on invasive mechanical ventilation at baseline, 13 on new or CPAP, and 64% on open systems, including high flow. They had a quite low SOFA score, and it was almost exclusively caused by a quite low PF ratio of about 12.5 kilopascals across all systems. So just to sum up, a very homogeneous populations characterized by COVID-19, hypoxemia, and respiratory failure. Cool. So this is the intervention for the first 30 days. The complete data is in the supplement, but after day 30, not many patients are still in the ICU. And as you can see, we have a very nice separation between the two groups. If we take the median for the entire period, for both groups, it's about 12 in the higher and about 9.5 in the lower. So a bit overshot in the lower, but almost identical to what we saw in the hot ICU trial. But we have separation of our intervention. This is reflected in the arterial saturation of oxygen at about 96 and 93, and a bit more overlap in the fraction of inspired oxygen as to be expected. So we have separation in the intervention. Then for the primary outcome, days alive without life support in 90 days. And it's nice to have more. The lower group had a median of 80, and the higher group had a median of 72. These data was not normally distributed. So as predefined in our protocol, we used an Van Eltran test. It's like a Mann-Whitney test, just you can stratify, and found a p-value at 0.009, so highly significant. The problem with non-parametric tests are you don't get an estimate of the magnitude of the difference. So as predefined, we also bootstrapped a GLM just with an identity link, so like a linear regression, and found a mean difference of about 6 days. So the lower group was better with about 6 days concerning the primary outcome. Good. This is me trying to visualize it. So in the x-axis we have days, at the y-axis we have percentage of patients. We have two figures, one for each target group, and then we have 3 categories represented by colors. And it shows how patients are allocated into these categories over time. And the categories are deceased, the dark blue one, alive and receiving life support, the teal one, and then the light blue one is alive without life support. So you want to be in the bottom. And as you can see, the higher target group had more patients deceased and more patients on life support throughout the intervention period. Secondary outcomes. I only have time for mortality, but I'll briefly note on the other two just in a minute. For mortality, we found 30% had died in the lower group and about 35% in the higher group. Multiplicity adjusted GLM found a risk difference of about 4% and a p-value of 18. So not significant, but trending. This is the same thing shown as survival curves with the lower target performing better. I will briefly mention that we found a clear trend toward fewer days in hospital for the lower target, and we found absolutely no difference in serious adverse events between the two groups. So we have some limitations. We stopped early due to slow recruitment. We have no blinding for practical reasons. We have no data on different virus variants evolving over time. We have no data on new COVID-19 treatments being introduced or outphased. We also have some strengths. It's a multi-center RCT. It's a pragmatic design. The same sites that participated in this trial also participated in the hot ICU trial, so they knew the targets, they knew how to handle them. We have a clear separation of our intervention, and we have consistent results across all outcomes, indicating the lower target to be better. So take home, this is the first trial on the subject of targeted oxygen for COVID patients in the ICU. We find that when we compare a target of 8 kilopascals to 12 kilopascals, the lower target performs better with about 6 days more alive without life support, a trend towards a lower mortality, fewer days in hospital, and no difference in serious adverse events. Finally, and in good time, I would like to thank all participants and next of kin, trial staff especially, the CRIC network for supporting the trial, the Danish Ministry of Higher Education and Science for funding it, the organizers of this conference for inviting us, and then from me personally, especially to my supervisors, Bodil, Olav, and Thomas, for supervising my PhD tenure the last 3 years and making it possible for me to be here today. This is the last slide, where I would like to start out by thanking the editor, Dr. Christopher Seymour, and some very good reviewers that greatly improved the trial, for accepting it for publication in JAMA, where it should be available now, I hope, or by using this fancy QR code. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frederik, and all your group for this paper that is now released online in JAMA. I would say synchronously, can be more. And we now move to another presentation on oxygenation targets, this time more individualized with Dr. Buell from Chicago.
Hello everyone, it's a great pleasure to be here. Bonjour à tous. So my name is Kevin Buell. I'm a trainee or fellow registrar at the University of Chicago, and it's a great pleasure to present to you today individualized treatment effects of oxygen targets in mechanically ventilated critical adults on behalf of all authors listed here. We have funding as a team from the NIH and the Health Research Council of New Zealand, but we have no relevant disclosures for this talk. So mechanical ventilation universally involves a titration of oxygen. Across the world, it's estimated that 13 to 20 million patients are mechanically ventilated every year. But despite this, the oxygenation target that optimizes the clinical outcomes for critical adults remains unknown. So as we've just seen, we could target a lower oxygenation target, which could cause hypoxia and tissue hypoxemia, other way around. Or we could target higher oxygenation, which could cause oxidative damage, inflammation, and increase the alveolar capillary permeability, all of which are associated with worse patient outcomes. So to study the effect of lower versus higher oxygenation targets, randomized trials were conducted across the world. Starting on the left, we had PILOT, which was conducted in North America. All the way to the right, in Australia and New Zealand, we have ICU ROCKS. And in the middle, we have many outstanding trials in Europe, and I'm sorry not to have added the last trial to this slide. However, these trials generally have shown no difference in the average treatment effect. And one reason for this may be that a lower versus higher oxygenation target had no effect for any patients. But a second possibility may be that a lower versus higher oxygenation target had different effects on outcomes for different patients, and that these differences average to a null. But in clinical practice, we know that some patients may be at the extremes of treatment effect. And if I was a 23-year-old male with septic shock and ARDS, or if I was an 85-year-old female with hypoxic brain injury, I would wish that my clinician would give me the appropriate oxygen target that optimized my clinical outcomes. And if we take a step back and think more broadly about the bedside and the way we deal with an individual treatment effect or an average treatment effect, our patients are asking for an individual treatment effect, but the way we practice medicine is that we apply an average treatment effect. But that's not what the patient asks for, and that's probably not what clinicians want. And unfortunately for us, subgroup analysis won't give us the answer because they don't produce a treatment effect for an individual patient. The reason for that is that an individual patient has multiple characteristics that may each affect the influence of oxygenation on outcome. So let's come back to our 23-year-old. He fits in or she fits into 3 separate subgroup analyses, and each may influence the effect of oxygenation on outcome. The second limitation is that subgroup analyses don't account for complex or nonlinear interactions between patient characteristics. And this is hard. And the reason it's hard is because an individual treatment effect is inherently unobservable. And the reason is that I can't observe the outcome for one individual patient if they get the intervention and the control simultaneously. What we can do is we can predict the individualized treatment effects. We're going to define this as the predicted difference in outcomes for one individual patient who is given the intervention already controlled, and we are going to condition that effect on their baseline characteristics, so the things that make them an individual. And lucky for us, machine learning is well suited to predict the individualized treatment effect because it can model complex nonlinear interactions between patient characteristics. And that's what we set out to do. We set out to derive and validate a machine learning model to predict individualized treatment effect of higher versus lower oxygen targets and mortality. And we started in North America in the pilot trial where the model was derived, and then separated by time and space, we externally validated the model in a second randomized trial of ICU ROCs from Australia and New Zealand. So to review these trials, pilot was a cluster randomized, cluster crossover trial that randomized 2,541 patients, and ICU ROCs was an individual patient parallel group trial that randomized 965 patients. Pilot had 3 arms, ICU ROCs had 2 arms, and for this reason, we just took the lower and the higher target arm in each trial, and we didn't use the intermediate arm. And as I've said, these trials were done across the world at separate times by separate investigators, but they coincidentally both use ventilated free days for primary outcome and mortality for secondary outcomes, and both of which found no difference in the average treatment effects. So let's take a look at what we actually did. Let's focus on model derivation in the pilot cohorts. We'll start off on the left-hand side, where we take the values of patient baseline characteristics before randomization, and we plug them into the model. Specifically, the characteristics that we looked at were age, sex, source of admission to the ICU, admitting diagnoses, vital signs, creatinine, PaCO2, vasopressors as a binary predictor, mode of mechanical ventilation, PEEP, and the predicted risk of 28-day mortality, which was separately derived using the non-respiratory SOFA score in pilot and the Apache 2 score in the ICU ROCs trial. And we put them into our model. The model is an algorithm. It's called RBoost. It's a tree-based, non-parametric machine learning model that uses the observed outcome, intervention assignment, and baseline covariate to make one output per patient. This output is a prediction, and specifically, it is the absolute difference in 28-day mortality with use of a lower versus higher oxygenation targets. And to facilitate the interpretation of this model and its outputs, if we get a negative number, which is color-coded in blue, we are predicting benefit from a lower SpO2 target. If we get a value around 0, we're predicting similar outcomes from lower or higher SpO2 target in gray. And if we get a positive number, we're predicting benefit from a higher SpO2 target. So let's look at the black box. This is the model, and what the model does is that instead of getting an average treatment effect for the whole cohort, we are going to get a predicted individualized treatment effect for each individual patient. And the way we get there is that we will input patient characteristics into the model, one characteristic at a time, and every time we input a characteristic, we're going to recalculate the treatment effect for each individual patient. Specifically, these were the most important patient characteristics for the model, ranging from mean arterial pressure, which was number 1, heart rate number 2, and age number 3, going all the way down to predicted risk of 28-day mortality. And the way we got this ordering is that we looked at the treatment effect when you used a median value and then recalculated the treatment effect for each individual patient and looked at the difference between those two. So kind of like a SHAP method for those who are familiar with machine learning, but the difference between the two tells you how important the characteristic was in determining that patient's individualized treatment effects. So let's get started. We plug in all the values of mean arterial pressure for all the patients, and what we can immediately see is that every patient has a predicted individualized treatment effect that is a wide range and differs from an average treatment effect. And as we do this again for heart rate and recalculated treatment effect, and again for age, and again and again and again until we get to the 10th variable, we can see that the lines become more horizontal. That is to say that each subsequent characteristic or predictor into the model is having a lesser effect in determining that individual's patient's predicted treatment effect. Finally, we reach the end, we get the predicted individualized treatment effect, and what we can see is that we are predicting patients that benefit from a higher SpO2 in red and patients that benefit from a lower SpO2 in blue. And if we take these values and just plot them out on a caterpillar plot, we can more fully appreciate the full range of treatment effects. We can also take these patients and split them up into equally sized thirds. So now we're looking at thirds of predicted individualized treatment effects in the validation cohort of ICU ROCs, where in blue we're getting negative numbers, and we're predicting patients to benefit from a lower SpO2, and in red, we're predicting benefit from a higher SpO2, and in gray, we're predicting similar outcomes from higher or lower. We can also see the full range. One patient had a predicted 27% decrease in absolute mortality from use of a lower SpO2, bottom left, all the way to top right, a 34% decrease in absolute mortality from use of a higher SpO2. The thirds also facilitate a comparison between patients who are predicted to benefit from lower or higher SpO2 targets, which we're going to go through next. Focusing on patient demographics, patients predicted to benefit from a lower SpO2 were older and more likely to be male. The same group of patients predicted benefit from a lower SpO2 had a higher prevalence of non-hypoxic brain injury and hypoxic brain injury, whereas patients predicted to benefit from a higher SpO2 had a higher prevalence of respiratory disease and sepsis. If we look at vital signs next, patients predicted to benefit from a higher SpO2 had higher values of heart rate, mean arterial pressure, and temperature. So to recap where we are in the presentation so far, we've derived the model in pilot. We've made evidence-based and personalized predictions for each individual patient in the ICU ROCs. We've described characteristics that lead to predictions of benefit for lower or higher SpO2. But what we haven't done is assess, are we correct in our predictions? Did we correctly identify patients that benefit from a lower or higher SpO2 target? And it's at this very important part that we're going to move away from predictions and we're going to talk about the observed effects. And we're going to start off by focusing on patients in blue, those who are predicted benefit from a lower SpO2. And what we do is that we can look at the mortality between the patients who were randomly assigned to lower SpO2 or higher SpO2. And what we can see is that patients predicted benefit from a lower SpO2 experienced lower mortality if randomized to the lower SpO2. And this difference was a 6.1 absolute reduction in mortality. For patients in red, they had lower mortality if they received a higher SpO2 in which benefit was predicted, and this difference was a 13% absolute reduction in mortality. And patients in gray, they had similar outcomes and they were predicted similar outcomes. If we put all this together, we can see that patients experienced lower mortality when randomized to the SpO2 group in which benefit was predicted. And if we now take these point estimates and add a 95% confidence interval around them and plot them out like this, we can see what looks to be like a trend over here. This trend is suggestive of effect modification. When we formally tested that, it was statistically significant, and that is to say, the predicted individualized treatment effects modified the actual effect of lower versus higher SpO2 targets on mortality. And it's because of this effect modification that's present that if we had used an SpO2 target predicted to be best for each patient by a model derived in the pilot trial, instead of the random allocation of SpO2, which is what happens in clinical care, we would have reduced the absolute overall mortality by 6.4 percentage points in the ICU ROX validation trial. So we believe our study has several strengths. First, external validation and a separate, large, temporally and geographically distinct randomized trial demonstrates the generalizability of the predictions beyond the original trial. Second, predicted individualized treatment effects from RCTs represent a step towards evidence-based and personalized medicine. There's multiple limitations, I'm just listing two. Non-harmonized collection of baseline characteristics and differences in trial design could have degraded model performance. And further validation is required before predicted individualized treatment effects can be used to inform clinical care. I wanted to summarize these findings here, which I've just listed out for our benefits, but if we take one thing away from this talk today, that is that patients experienced lower mortality when randomized to the SpO2 target in which benefit was predicted. Finally, to conclude, oxygenation targets that are individualized using machine learning analysis of randomized trials may reduce the mortality of critically ill adults. But more importantly, we hope that our study can serve as a proof of concept that predicted individualized treatment effects can inform, improve, and individualize the clinical care of patients. So with that, and in good time, I would like to thank all of the authors on this paper, which I've put their pictures up here, as well as the leadership at my local institution, which allows me to be on a training grant to contribute to this research. My email's here. I hope you contact me with any questions. And I also hope that you will look at the paper online, which I'm told is released today. So with that, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Kevin. We are going to move on to the next speaker, but congratulations to you and all of your colleagues. And I'm having an absolutely fantastic time in this session. I hope the rest of you are. And I expect that this will continue with what is unfortunately the last speaker, Michelle Paton, who is going to speak to us on the association of active mobilization variables with adverse events and mortality in patients requiring mechanical ventilation in the ICU.
Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak to you today on our publication, which has also gone live on Lancet Respiratory Med this morning. So, early mobilisation forms part of many clinical guidelines and recommended bundles of care for our patients in the ICU, with a lot of investigations and systematic reviews already on this topic. But following the team trial last year and a systematic review that our group published in the New England Journal of Medicine Evidence 2022, looking specifically at long-term outcomes, we identified some increased risk with adverse events and mortality. So we really wanted to investigate that further, and we've just finished our review, which we wanted to determine the effects of active mobilisation compared to usual care on adverse events and mortality in the ICU setting. Specifically, we wanted to try and drill down into some of the subgroups of how we perform mobilisation to see if we could identify any sources of harm. So we wanted to look at how mobilisation was implemented in terms of the timing of commencement, the duration of mobilisation that was achieved, as well as the ventilation status and admission diagnoses of our patients. So although not presented in Cochrane, and hopefully Sharon agrees that we have got some good methodology here, but we completed a systematic review with 8 major databases and 2 clinical trial registries to ensure we captured as most data as possible. And this search was relevant up till March 16 last year. We specifically searched for randomised controlled trials that investigated the effect of early mobilisation in adult patients, either during mechanical ventilation or after a period of mechanical ventilation. And we wanted to compare that to usual practice. So we ensured the trials had at least a separation between the amount of mobilisation that was completed, but usual care could have consisted of either some mobilisation, a lesser amount, or a later application. We followed the methodological expectations of Cochrane interventional reviews, and we reported the guideline following the PRISMA reporting expectations. We assessed our evidence using the Cochrane Risk of Bias Tool 1, and we completed both frequentist and Bayesian analysis, and we used the Cochrane Risk of Bias Tool version 1 and graded our certainty of evidence using the grade approach. You can see the PRISMA flowchart of our inclusion criteria here, and so we screened almost 14,500 articles to get our 466 trials that we did full text review. And just to highlight that we ended up with 67 included trials, 52 that reported adverse events and 59 that reported mortality. Looking at the characteristics of the studies that were included, we had 24 countries represented and just over 7,000 patients. 56% of the patients completed active mobilisation as their treatment intervention, and that progressive mobilisation. You can see the risk of bias of the trials here, and as we can't blind for participants and personnel, we utilised some published recommended guidelines to rate the grading of our evidence, and using the quality criteria of random sequence generation, allocation concealment, blinding of outcome assessment, and incomplete data, which gave us an overall risk of 30 trials that had low risk, 16 had some concerns, and 21 that were rated as high risk. When we look at our primary outcome of adverse events, 15 of the 67, as I mentioned, didn't even record adverse events or comment on adverse events during their trial periods. 13 merely stated that adverse events didn't occur during the trial, and 30 of the 52 that did comment didn't give us enough specific details around the types of adverse events that had actually occurred, as we did hope to grade them as minor and major to give some more details for clinicians on implementation of mobilisation. However, there was only one adverse event that wasn't transient, and that was the left-sided weakness reported in the team trial that didn't occur during a mobilisation session, but did occur over the course of the admission, and therefore was deemed part of an adverse event in the interventional arm. So I guess my thought is, are these actually adverse events, or are we just recording physiological changes to the exercise that we're actually implementing? When we completed our meta-analysis, we found that there was no effect of mobilisation on the occurrence of adverse events. However, we rated this as low certainty of evidence, and that was mostly due to the heterogeneity in the result, the imprecision, and the risk of bias. Although you can see the result is confirmed in our sensitivity analysis with the low risk of bias represented, the low risk of bias studies at the top. Overall, in our Bayesian analysis, we showed that there was a 17.26% chance of mobilisation leading to an adverse event. However, and overall, a 2.96% occurrence rate. So that was of the 25 studies that actually reported the number of adverse events for the number of mobilisation sessions. And as I mentioned, all but one of those was transient and resolved either with cessation of the intervention or with minor medical attention. We did do a per-patient adverse event analysis as well, as this was identified in the team trial as something that may cause issues. And we did show a higher risk of the intervention group receiving adverse events or having adverse events occurring. But when we link this with mortality, although there is a trend, there was actually no clear effect on mortality for that intervention group. Specifically looking at mortality, and I realise that this is again quite a busy slide, but we used ICU discharge or the closest time point to that reported so that we could get as much data as possible. And to highlight the end result there, you can see that there's no effect of mortality or no effect of mobilisation on mortality. We determined that to have moderate certainty as per the grade approach, and with Bayesian analysis that came out at a 37.7% probability of death with mobilisation. And I know that might sound a little bit high, but I guess the flip side is you've got 63.3% if you don't get the mobilisation. Looking into the subgroup analyses, and you can see quite a bit of red listed there in our subgroups. A lot of that was because of the lack of information that the trials reported, especially around the duration of mobilisation that was achieved. But also there's a lot of trials that are done in mixed cohorts without little clarification around our ability to actually separate those. But when we did our frequentist analysis, you can see that there was no effect of duration on the risk of either adverse events or mortality. I have highlighted in red the results that had significant heterogeneity. Again, looking at timing and commencing of mobilisation, this didn't find any clear effect. When we looked at the ventilation status, although there is a higher risk of the patients that received mobilisation having an adverse event when they were extubated, this does only include one trial, so needs to be interpreted with caution. And again, although some large confidence intervals, the admission diagnosis didn't seem to have a clear effect on either adverse events or mortality. We went on to complete a Bayesian analysis to try and give a bit more of a clarification for the clinicians around the probability of treatment harm. And you can see here, this is a Bayesian graphed with the probability of harm on the x-axis. And you can see that the longer duration of mobilisation showed a higher percentage of harm. And we kind of look at 50% being, I guess, the cutoff. If you've got a higher probability of 50%, you've got more chance of having harm than benefit. However, the duration, if we achieve lower amounts of duration, we had a higher probability of mortality. The one thing to mention on this, they are unadjusted results, so we haven't taken into consideration the illness severity, which may obviously be one of the leading causes for why the patients didn't get to mobilise, and that needs to be taken into consideration. Looking at the timing of mobilisation commencement, and we can see a higher probability of harm if we commence our mobilisation early, and we did use 72 hours as our cut-off point, which is where a lot of guidelines recommend mobilisation to commence. When we look at our ventilation status, our frequentist analysis did show an increased risk with the adverse events when patients were extubated, but ventilation status didn't seem to make a difference for the probability of adverse events, whether you did that when they were ventilated or not. They did seem to have quite a lot of adverse events, or a high probability. And moving on to admission diagnosis, it's only the surgical cohort that seems to have a high probability of adverse events compared to medical. So looking at some of the strengths and limitations of this review, we feel that we had quite a rigorous protocol that we pre-published on Prospero prior to completing our analysis. We really tried to have clear definitions of both the intervention and control group that resemble clinical practice to try and make this meaningful for clinicians on the ground. We have quite a robust and thorough analysis with both frequentist and Bayesian analyses, as well as some post-hoc meta-regressions. And we do feel that this has quite a large data set, and we individually contacted a lot of authors to try and get some clarity around the definitions to improve the ability of us to allocate the data. There are obviously limitations. We have quite high heterogeneity and poor reporting of adverse events, which really limits our ability to have any certainty in those evidence. The intervention and usual care are very heterogeneous, so this will probably influence our effect sizes. And one of the big things that we are looking to do in the next component of our project is we're going to do an individual patient data meta-analysis to see if we can drill down into some of these clarities, because we did have to use the summary data to allocate the subgroup analysis, which will also probably hinder some of these conclusions. So in conclusion, I think we've shown that early mobilisation is actually safe and effective in an ICU environment, with less than a 3% chance of an adverse event actually occurring, and no clear effect on adverse events or mortality overall. I think though, when we're thinking about subgroup analyses and how we actually do this in practice, it still is a bit of a mystery. So we definitely need to drill down a little bit more into that individual patient level data to see what patients do and don't benefit the most. And I'd obviously like to thank my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, Professor Carol Hodgson, as well as the co-authors on this paper, some of which are in the audience today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this amazing session, and we are we could have asked a lot of questions. We could have raised a lot of wonderful hypothesis, but this is the format of this session. There are no more questions, so with Derek Angus, my friend and colleague, we are delighted to wish you a wonderful Isicem conference. Have a great day.